Hello. This video is intended to support and guide participating teachers as they begin to move through the self-assessments of the California Standards for the Teaching Profession. The purpose of the self-assessment essentially is to reflect upon the evidence that you have already collected from your current or recent fact work, such as your context for teaching, where you uncovered information about your students, your school, your district, and your community, observations that you have done, such as for the observation write-up, your support provider conversations, and if you're in year one, this was the year that you completed the assessment for teaching and learning. Another purpose is for you to reflect upon your practice, resulting in your identification of the strengths and challenges of your practice. Here we can see a visual that supports your previous work in the context for teaching and learning. And if you're in year one, you have already completed the assessment of teaching and learning this year. If you're in year two, this was what you did last year. This was where you had conversations with your support provider about what you know about your practice, what you want to know about your practice, and what you would like your support provider to observe. That was followed by in-depth conversations with insights as to what you learned from that observation and conversation. In addition, in the observation write-up, you observed a colleague teaching, identifying a specific purpose to your observation, and reflecting upon what you may or may not want to bring back to your practice. You're now asked to take all of these experiences, plus the many experiences from your day-to-day teaching practice, and reflect upon your teaching practice as a whole. So this represents your self-assessments. This is where you've been, and this is where you're going. As a direct result of these self-assessments, you will be asked to select a focus. This focus will then drive your inquiry that you will find later in year one and which you are completing 2 times in year 2. What you see on the screen currently is the individual induction plan that is completed prior to any participating teacher embarking upon their inquiry. As we discussed in the self-assessments for induction standards, box number 1 reflects essentially what you have learned about your practice and where you would like to focus as a result of your self-assessments. There then is an inquiry question, but right now we're going to focus on this particular question in box number 3. As we zoom into this box of information on the individual induction plan, we can see that we're specifically asked which CSTP elements will be addressed within our inquiry. And a note here, make note of your current placement on the continuum of teaching practice. What we're going to be talking about now is that actual continuum of teaching practice and your self-assessment relative to the California Standards for the Teaching Profession. What you're looking at currently is what's called a placemat, or a single sheet showing all of the California Standards for the Teaching Profession. We're going to zoom in on one of them in a minute, but here you'll see it says Standard 1, and here is the language, the overarching language for Standard 1. Underneath that, you're going to find there are what's called elements, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, etc. What these are individual portions of Standard 1 that help to define what is meant by this overarching statement. The document that I have inserted onto the screen is the tool that you will use to record your self-assessment as connects to each of the California Standards for the Teaching Profession. As we look more closely at these directions, we can see that this provides us with a place to start, and in addition, there are tags to help support us. So the directions state, this self-assessment tool is intended to be used in conjunction with something called the Continuum of Teaching Practice, or CTP, which will be shown in just a few seconds. This provides the established criteria for each of the elements of the California Standards of the Teaching Profession. Note that there's a tag here, and as we hover over this tag, we end up with a few more directions to help us understand what we're asked to do. Note here, after reading the CTP, use the collected evidence to assess your current practice. We'll be making sense of that as well. You will complete the self-assessment at the end of your assessment of teaching and learning and following each inquiry. So here we know what our supporting documents are and when it is that we'll be completing this self-assessment. And in addition, we have tags to help support us in our understanding of that process. This current screenshot shows you what the entire page looks like for the first page of the self-assessment of the CSTPs. We're going to zoom in a little bit to show you some of the detail, but before we do, note that there are 4 different assessments. Year 1 initial assessment, Year 1 final assessment, Year 2 initial assessment, Year 2 final assessment. So much like the document for the induction standards, this particular document will be used throughout your 2-year process. Each time you revisit this, it will be a matter of updating. Let's take a look at this process of self-assessment by zeroing in on CSTP1, Engaging and Supporting All Students in Learning. You'll find on this particular document, here is the main language of CSTP1, the overarching consideration. And here are the levels that we're asked to consider as we begin our self-assessment. So anyone's first question would be, as I go to reflect upon, for example, 1.1, using knowledge of students to engage them in learning, in order to effectively state where my practice is at the current moment, I need to know what these emerging, exploring, applying, integrating, and innovating means in relation to this particular element of CSTP1. So how do I determine that? We're going to take a look at a document called the CTP, the Continuum of Teaching Practice. If we have our CTP side by side with this particular page document, we'll be able to more effectively respond to these levels of teaching practice as we move forward in our self-assessment. What you see on the screen in front of you is the cover page to a 52-page document. But before you get overwhelmed, know that this is here to support you and working with your support provider, setting this document and your chart document side by side. I think once that you see how both of those items are set up, it will not seem overwhelming, and you'll know that this document is intended to be a support for you. For example, this is page 10 of the document, and let's take a look at it. It's Standard 1, CSTP, Engaging and Supporting All Students in Learning, and this is Element 1.1. And here's the wording of Element 1.1, using knowledge of students to engage them in learning. So there are many ways we could interpret that. You'll notice here are our levels again: emerging, exploring, applying, integrating, and innovating. So what you see below each of these, say emerging in this column, is what that type of practice would look like in the classroom if we were to state that our practice was emerging for element 1.1. Let's take a look under emerging. We have a description, learns about students through data provided by the school and/or district assessments. Down here, this refers to the students and what's occurring with the students if the level of our practice is emerging. There are times when we may feel that our practice is emerging, and yet when we look at what the students are doing, we might say that's applying. There's nothing wrong with that. What we want to remember about our self-assessments is we're not really looking at that one best lesson plan or lesson series that we do or have done multiple times that is amazingly outstanding. In addition, we don't want to reflect upon the class maybe 2 days ago where we tried something new and we want to see how we can improve upon that. What we want to consider is what is our practice on a day-by-day basis with all of our classes? What do we do on a consistent basis, and what do our students do on a consistent basis? This screen may be quite challenging to read, but what we're trying to show you is on the top is the page from the CTP, or Continuum of Teaching Practice, where we can see for element 1.1, we have descriptions for each of our levels of our teaching practice to review. The document we're actually making our notations on is on the bottom, and this was one of the original documents that you were shown. So here's element 1.1, here's element 1.1, here's the text that goes with the levels, and here's where we mark for ourselves and in order to discuss with our support providers where we feel our practice is at the current moment based upon these descriptions. So while utilizing these two documents may seem overwhelming at first, the CTP is a support that will allow you to make some decisions or considerations in reflecting about your teaching practice. After you complete these self-assessments, along with the self-assessments based on the induction standards, the discussions with your support provider becomes one of the most critical pieces in your reflection. Often you'll find those discussions are extremely valuable and help you clearly identify for yourselves areas where you would like to choose to grow your practice and areas where you feel you already have valuable strengths. As with your self-assessment on induction standards, fact verification comes into play, and once you've completed your work with your support provider and he or she has signed off as having reviewed and discussed your information, then fact verification and how that works for your district or site moves forward. Here is a view of that same fact verification sheet that we looked at in terms of your induction standards. Here are the expectations connected to each of the induction standards. As we get to the bottom, we now see the documents that we've just been talking about. It's your self-reflections based upon the California Standards for the Teaching Profession. And for expectations, note that it says, please use the Continuum of Teaching Practice, the CTP booklet, to determine where you are in your teaching practice for CSTPs 1 and 2. Enter an X in the appropriate category.